Hi, Peter Jones, Chartered Surveyor, author and property investor, and in this short series of videos we're going to look at different property strategies. This series of videos might actually be a bit of a refresher if you're an experienced investor. If you're not so experienced, I thought it might be quite useful to go through all the different strategies and A, outline what they are, and B, give you my take on what the pros and cons of each strategy are. Even if you are more experienced, it might be worth watching this anyway, just to refresh your memory, and also because things change. I know that when I started out in property I was pursuing a particular strategy. I now have 3 or 4 different strategies which I look at in property. And things are changing the whole time. The market changes, the law changes, the way that we do things changes. And so strategies, I suppose, come into fashion and strategies go out of fashion. What worked last year may not work next year, and vice versa. What wasn't working next year may be perfectly good next year. So it's worth keeping an eye on all the different strategies and not dismissing any. But we're going to start sort of right at the bottom of the pile, as it were, with buy-to-let. Now, I don't mean bottom of the pile in terms of not being a great strategy, but it's probably the most simple strategy. But even then, there are nuances to it, because I'm going to talk today about very basic vanilla buy-to-let, but there are more sophisticated ways of doing buy-to-let, which we'll think about in the next video. But at a very basic level, buy-to-let, I guess, we're just buying a property, sticking a tenant in and collecting the rent. But even then, we have different choices. Are we going to buy the property using a mortgage, or are we going to buy the property using 100% cash? The problem for most people with that approach would be actually saving 100% cash. Even a cheap property is going to cost a relatively large amount of money. At the moment, it's possible probably to go up north and buy a house for 50, 60, 70,000 pounds, which in the scheme of things, compared to, say, London prices, isn't that much. But for most people to save £70,000 cash is going to take them a long, long time, unless they've got a mega job, earning, perhaps bonuses of £1 million in the city. For most of us, it's going to be very, very hard. So for most of us, we probably are going to be using a mortgage, in which case we're probably going to be starting by saving up the deposit. Another nuance could be whether we use interest-only or capital repayment mortgages. Now, the received wisdom is that if you're an investor, you want to use interest only, and there's many, many reasons for that. I'm not going to even go into that now because I could make a video about that. Maybe I'll make a note, I'll do a video about that. But there's many, many reasons why, when you weigh the pros and cons, probably an interest-only mortgage just outweighs a capital repayment mortgage. But for some people, buying a house, sticking a tenant in, and using capital repayment mortgage is a great way of using it almost as a savings plan. Because the tenant, this is one of the great things about property, which I think perhaps not everybody realises, but the tenant is effectively buying the property. Why? Because if the rent is greater than the mortgage, and let's face it, it should be, or else you probably shouldn't be buying that property, then effectively the tenant is paying the mortgage for you and the tenant is buying the property for you. So if you take out a 20-year capital repayment mortgage, for example, by the end of the 20 years the property is paid off, it's unencumbered. In theory that might be a good thing. Actually I don't think it is, but again maybe that's something for another video. But that is a fairly basic strategy. Another nuance on this could be buying your properties at what we could call below market value. Now, to some extent that's a bit of a trite term. What does it actually mean? What is the value of a property? Well, we could argue that the value of a property is the amount that somebody's prepared to pay for it. Actually, if you talk to the RICS and look at the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors' definition of open market value, they wouldn't actually concur with that. But for our purposes, that's good enough. So we could get into semantics about what below market value is, but we can all agree that it's probably a good thing to buy a bargain property or to try and buy it as cheaply as possible, because if we can buy it as cheaply as possible, that will increase the return on our money invested, whether that be in a deposit or whether we're buying it 100% for cash. So a nuance on this could be buying a property at the best possible price and negotiating very hard. Another nuance, though, could be that we just pay almost asking price. Now, why would somebody do that? Well, I think this is one of the interesting things about property. Not everybody who goes into property and not everybody who wants to buy property necessarily wants to be a sophisticated investor in that sense. And by sophisticated investor, I don't mean the FCA definition, but I mean somebody who's sort of thinking about how to get every last point of a percent of return from their money. Some people are just happy to buy property and put their money in and use the property as a place to store their money. If you go through the Sunday Times Rich List, for example, you'll see many examples of people who've made their money outside of property, but they actually store their wealth in property. So we can see that with what we could call vanilla buy-to-let investing. I was talking to an estate agent contact of mine who's based in Nottingham a while back, and he was telling me that he has a list of investors mainly based in London who he sells properties to, and I was asking him about that. I was saying, well, how much do your London investors want by way of a discount when they buy a property off you? And he looked at me a bit blankly and he said, I don't give them a discount. They pretty much pay full asking price. And when I looked a bit baffled at that, he said, well, a lot of them, they just want to park their money somewhere safe, and as long as I can say this is a good house in a good area and it should rent okay, and if I can give them that comfort, they'll buy the property at almost full asking price, and then they'll just use it to store their wealth. They're not bothered about getting 25% off market value, for example. They just want to spend 70, 80, 90,000 pounds on a property which is going to yield them 6, 7 or 8%. And for many people that is good enough, and that's why for some people, if you want to buy one or two, maybe buying the house next door, maybe buying a house in the adjoining street so that you can manage it, maybe buying a property at almost full asking price. Maybe you offer 5% below asking price and you think you've got yourself a deal. That's good enough. But there are other things that we can do which make buy-to-let investing far more nuanced and far more exciting. And we'll be looking at that in the next video. But if you just want to put your money into property, if you just want to store your wealth in property, if you just want to have a tenant paying down your mortgage for you, all of these are good things to consider. So, until the next video, here's to successful property investing.